So here we start from why we're fishing too much. And so let's try to have a look about that and what are the drivers of systematic overfishing of renewable resources or fisheries. Uh, the point I want to make here that overfishing occurs because of the specific nature of renewable resources and because of human behavior and our inherent tendency to free riding, basically, even to some extent to agree about a coordinate effort in exploiting that, but then the individual personal basically benefits of not complying and doing a little bit more. And it's not evil, it's just part of the human behavior and human nature. But I also make the point why this happens systematically when it is important to basically put in place mechanisms that prevent and try to correct, overexploitation when these occur. Uh, and I want to make the point clear, just by making a strong, a comparison and basically appreciating the difference between, the exploitation of renewable resources that have an inherent dynamics and the production of our other market goods. For instance, in classic economic theory, the production of market goods occurs through basically labor, energy, and production material, raw material that are assembled through labor and thanks to energy in order to produce market goods. One of the foundation of this aspect here is that when we look at the output, the production output from basically a factory, a company, in general, what we see is that the more effort we put in producing, for instance, mobile phones or any other object, market goods, the larger is going to be the output. There are, economy of scale. So, if we increase production above a certain level, we might become much more effective and, produce much more and much faster given an extra unit of effort, which is describing this kind of exponential grow, curve or the output, production function. Then there is maybe a linear phase in which if we double the effort, we double the output, which is okay. And there might be this economy of scale. For instance, there might be that at some point we are limited, for instance, by the procurement of raw materials. Or we know well, for instance, when we study like crazy for an exam, that up to some point, we just burn out. We can't work for 20 hours a day, and maybe we can do one day, but at some point, we collapse. And so, there is, this area here, which is about the diseconomy, about the fact that if we increase, we might not get, if we double the effort, doesn't mean, the output. But in general, this is pretty much a monotonic growing production function. What happened to our fishing stocks, our fisheries? Well, we have seen very clear density, effective density dependent dynamics. And what we have seen that the per capita rate of growth that you can see here, it's a decreasing factions of stock density. Okay, so capital Rn, which is an instantaneous per capita rate of growth, is a decreasing function of n. When we look at the dn over dt, the population growth rate or the rate of change in the population, through time, we have seen how in general we can describe this as the stock n times the per capita growth rate. Now, R of n is a decreasing function of n, and n, of course, is a linear increasing function. Okay, so when we multiplied R of n, times n, we basically get, this function that if R of n, for instance, is a linear linear function, such as in the case of logistic growth, we get a parabolic function with a downward concavity, which tell us that the rate of growth of the population first increase, reach a peak, and eventually drop down to a level which is described here, which correspond, as we've seen, to the undisturbed carrying capacity of a population, an undisturbed population that is not fished. So we've seen that in absence of fishing, our population will grow first exponentially and then level off to the carrying capacity, the classic S-shape function of logistic growth. Now, let's look at how do we compute the yield here. And the basic assumption that we can make is that the yield, the harvest, is going to be proportional to two fundamental parameters. One variable. So if I throw the net in a fishing ground, the more fish there are, the more fish I'm likely, to harvest. And so this is one of the elements I expect. The second element is that the more effort I put, in general, at least in the short run, the more I expect to fish. So if I basically, cast 2 fishing nets instead of 1, I'm expected to fish more. Okay, if I spend 2 hours instead of 1, or 2 weeks instead of 1 week, I expect to fish more. Now, this relationship, I want to say, is not always linear as I represented here, but just let's assume to begin with that is why the yield is proportional to E. And E is the fishing effort here, and then we have a parameter here that represent the so-called catchability. Is a parameter that is an aggregated parameter, depend upon fish mobility, when you move, whether during the day or the night, the season, ontogenic movement, but also depend upon, the technology, so to speak, that I'm using, which type of fishing gears, how big are the engines that I'm using to pull the net. And so these are all elements that, are going to be, summed into the parameter Q, which is called the catchability coefficient. Now, if we look at this function here, so we have f of n, which is our instantaneous stock recruitment function, which is represented in blue here, and then we have QEN. Now, if we plot this into this plot here, where on the horizontal axis we have the stock density n, QEN is basically the equation of a straight line whose slope is given by the product of Q and E, the effort. Okay, so assuming Q constant for the time being, which is not being, if we look over 50 years of increasing power of the engines and geospatial tools to identify stocks and move the boats, etc., etc. But if we assume that Q is constant, the slope of that function is mostly proportional to E, the fishing effort. So as you can see here, basically when the stock is low, what we see here is that recruitment is larger than the harvest. So the green line here represents the harvest, and so the population, although harvested, will tend to increase. But if we exceed, when the green line, which is the catch, exceed the recruitment, which is the blue line, per unit time, then we're removing more than the population is able to produce, and so the population size will tend to decrease. So where there is an intersection between the stock recruitment relationship, the blue line, and the harvesting function, which is this linear green line, well, we expect this to be an equilibrium point, right? And the harvest is in fact equal to this red dotted segment, which represent how much I remove to be back basically at the next time step to the same point there. Okay, so this is an equilibrium point and depend upon E, assuming Q is constant. Okay, so if I increase effort, I expect the slope of this function, basically, as you see, to increase. Okay, and when this is important because now I can use this information, which has been reported here over this plot in which I have stock, the population density on the horizontal axis, and the population growth rate and the annual yield, they are measures on the same unit, so the harvest on the vertical axis. I can build up basically a new diagram that is represented here, where I put, as you can see here, the effort on the horizontal axis, and I have specifically the yield, which is exactly on the same scale here. So this is measures on the same unit. That means if when I do this, this is for the effort E1. So I can plot E1, find the E1 here on the horizontal axis and report Y1, the harvest, the long-term equilibrium harvest given E1. And you can see that here. Okay, so we got E1 and Y1. Okay, they're same axis. That's why I just simply, translated on this new plot that I have here on my right. Then if I increase E2, okay, the effort to E2, well, I will identify a new equilibrium point, a new long-term harvest, which I indicate here as Y2. And again, I can report that on this diagram here. And I can do that with E3. Okay, I think, you have seen, how we build up. And when we further increase effort, I find, another point here. So I can do that maybe by trial and errors, fishing, which is going to take a hell of a lot of time to do that, or through modeling and simulations, and I'm doing here in this diagram. Then when I have all the relationship point by point, as you see, I can determine the yield as a function of the fishing effort, okay, which is represented here by the red curve. Now, the interesting things here, when we look at yield as a function of fishing effort, and we look at the stock density as the function of fishing effort, is that while I'm increasing the fishing effort, I have a phase in which the yield increases, just like any other market goods, which is fantastic. And this gives me confidence that if I put more effort, or if we collectively put more effort, we should be able to fish more, which for the collectivity is going to be great, okay? At the same time, the stock, of course, decreases in time. The more I harvest, basically, year after year, and so it's gonna, drop down to lower and lower level. And the interesting point here is that basically there is a level of effort for which the yield is maximum. Okay, guys? And this is called, it's a very important, it's called the maximum sustainable yield, or MSY, which is one of the pillar of basically fishery management. This concept, I just want to say upfront, it's been contested, okay? And there are more sophisticated ways of defining fishery reference point that are more conservative and are aimed to prevent fishery collapse. But MSY still remain today one of the pillars that is important to know. It's a milestone, it's a yardstick, a reference point that is important to learn and to know, okay? So the idea here basically is that, effort increases, but then, we start to have sort of a diseconomy of scale. So you reach a maximum, which is fantastic. And if we further increase effort rather than increasing the output, we're actually decreasing the output, as you can see here, right? So I move from MSY to EI, and I decrease it, and if I move to EII, I further decreases, okay? So for every effort which is superior to the effort that guarantees the maximum sustainable yield, my population basically will be overexploited. So we'll drop down to even lower level that the stock here on the vertical axis at EMSY, so the stock at MSY, okay? And the stock at MSY, I just want to make it very clear and very upfront, is already lower than the carrying capacity. For obvious reason, we are exploiting the resources, and of course, we can't have the population of the carrying capacity while we are exploiting, so we're removing, we're decreasing that. And how much it is depend upon the nature of the dynamic of the species. Now, for the sake of an example that I'm going to show you very soon, let's change, and rather than using, yield in terms of biomass, for instance, tons of fish that are landed at the market, the harbor, every month or every year, I'm going to use dollar. I assume I'm going to really transform that in dollars. And I assume that when we collectively, so all the fishermen that are exploiting a resource are exploiting when the overall joint integrated effort is equal to E at MSY, the output is maximum. It corresponds, for instance, to $6 million, just to make an example. But if for any reason I increase, this effort further, the overall output is going to be lower, $5 million. And if I increase it even more, I'm going to have only $4 million. Now, some of you, might legitimately ask, well, if I know what is MSY, why, for what reason should I, further increase the effort if this is counterproductive because I put more energy, so it's going to be more expensive, I'm going to gain less. I'm going to get out of my fishery. And actually, this is a really good question, in fact. And in fact, the next set of slides are basically to show you why this actually happens. And we're going to take a little break and move to the next video in a moment. Okay?